delighted to introduce today's speakers. We're joined today by Dr. Rob Higham and Professor Jake Anders. They're two of the researchers from the Free School Projects team at UCL Institute of Education. Worth noting that the team also includes Dr. Golo Henseke, who is unfortunately unable to join us today as originally planned, as well as Gabrielle Shuey, Francis Green and Ruth McGinnity. And this team won last year's ONS People's Choice Award for their analysis of the impact of free schools, which were introduced in England in 2010 with the aim of improving school standards. So without further ado, I want to thank you both for joining us.
So, well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for the introduction, Beth. So I'm here together, as you said, with my colleague, Jake Anders. We'd like to provide a, thanks, Jake, yeah. We'd like to provide an overview of the project we led on the impact of free schools on neighbouring schools. We'll set out briefly our aims and methods before focusing on several of our main findings, including on the potential impacts of free schools on neighbouring schools, student attainment and social segregation in the local area around free schools. As Beth said, if you'd like to use the chat to ask any questions, Jake can kindly monitor those and either answer them there or we can seek to cover them at the end. So I'd like to start just with a reminder of the free school policy's aims. As you may be aware, free schools were introduced in 2010 as a flagship policy of the coalition government. The policy enabled new providers from civil society as well as educational organisations to open new state schools independent of local government, including where there were surplus places, at least initially. So while the policy has evolved over time, its original aims were well summarised by the National Audit Office, which noted that the government aimed, in quotes, to open high quality schools, and that it expected the free school programme to raise standards across the school system through increasing choice and competition, injecting competition between local schools, tackling educational inequality and encouraging innovation. So a fairly ambitious programme. In many ways, these aims reflected and indeed were partly borrowed from policies in Sweden and the US, countries that had sought to secure system improvement, not only by allowing new providers to open schools, but also through the choice, competition and contestability that these schools might create. And this reflects, of course, or is informed by the wider concept of efficient competition, wherein free schools would incentivize neighbours to deploy their resources more efficiently to compete over academic quality. So in the charter school context, BETS helpfully summarises several key assumptions of efficient competition in the school context as a chain of causation. These are the assumptions that, in our context, free schools would compete well on academic quality, parents would express strong preferences for free schools, neighbours would perceive new competitive threats and respond by improving quality, and student attainment would thereby improve. There are, in practice, however, numerous potential disruptions to this chain. As Betts argues, free schools may not offer better quality, parents may not prioritise or be able to identify academic quality, existing schools may not perceive new competition or may not respond in ways that improve quality. So little change or even deterioration in student attainment could result. For instance, the National Audit Office expressed concern that free schools could make good quality neighbouring schools less viable, particularly in context of surplus places. So further, a range of researchers highlighted the potential of social selection, wherein rather than academic quality, schools compete over the social economic status of students, including students perceived to be better positioned to perform well. And this can set up a different chain of assumed effects, potentially leading to increased social segregation as an undesirable outcome. Of course, on the slide, these are idealized processes of efficient competition and social selection, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Competition due to a free school's presence could work through a mix of mechanisms. So informed by these insights, our project had two main aims. First, we sought to analyse the potential mechanisms through which mainstream free schools might impact on their neighbours. And this was important as much research on competitive effects tends at least to assume competition is taking place and then moves directly to analyse outcomes. So we were interested in where free schools locate to understand the context of free schools and potential endogeneity issues. And then following Betts's assumed chains of causation, we aim to analyse free schools' academic quality and intakes, parental preferences for and student enrolment in neighbouring schools, whether neighbouring schools perceived new competition and responded by taking any actions due to a free school's presence. And second, as outcomes, we sought to analyse the potential impacts of free schools on improvement or deterioration in student attainment in neighbouring schools and on any increase or decrease in social segregation in the local area. So to progress these aims, we developed a mixed method approach. Our main empirical strategy followed a crazy experimental design, identifying within school changes in enrolment and attainment due to treatment by a free school opening relative to the counterfactual that a neighbouring school had not been impacted by a free school opening. To do this, we used a matched difference and differences design, drawing on data from the National People Database and other linked data sets. And our focus was on the mainstream free school population as a whole and the average effects of free schools on their neighbours. But we also, as we'll come on to see, explored potential variations in that. Our analysis period was 2010 to 2020, the first decade of the free school programme, essentially. We initially planned to analyse up to 2022, but the pandemic meant attainment data was, of course, not published for those years. We also administered a survey of neighbouring school leaders, receiving 328 responses, and we developed 9 case studies of local areas in which a free school had opened, interviewing staff in the free school and participating neighbouring schools. So for reasons of time, I can't describe our methods in detail today, but one further point to highlight is our definition of neighbouring schools. So we identified a neighbour when a school experienced the opening of a mainstream free school of the same phase in their own neighbourhood area. And we defined a neighbouring school's neighbourhood area as the travel distance to the school's 9th nearest school. So whilst this was necessarily somewhat arbitrary, it followed precedents set in the existing literature. And we also interrogated how our neighbourhood definition might influence our findings, including by developing robustness checks that gradually reduce the size of our neighbourhood areas. But using this main definition, while mainstream free schools were a relatively small percentage of all schools, we estimated just over 10% of mainstream primaries and 35% of secondaries became neighbouring schools of a free school by 2020. So I'll now very briefly summarise our first 3 sets of findings so that we have that for context. So first, we found free school locations were associated with forecast need for new places and with higher ethnic diversity locally. There was little evidence, however, that free schools prioritised areas with low academic quality or high deprivation beyond responding to predicted price need in ethnically diverse areas. So this first finding questions some more earlier government claims that providers would be motivated to serve deprived areas to make a difference, as this did not occur widely as a primary aim. We should also remain slightly cautious about whether forecast need has always materialized around free schools. The DfE's assessment of the accuracy of their own forecast data showed a regular over forecasting of about 2% during our analysis period. Second, on academic quality, free schools were not high quality schools on average during our analysis period. So there were certainly high quality free schools, but there were also the reverse. So we found primary free schools performed on average worse than a matched sample of similar schools, and when compared more simplistically to their own neighbours at Key Stage 2. And secondary free schools performed on average no better or worse at GCSE. I mean, there's two comparisons. Of course, we recognise change can occur over time and free schools might improve, including as more have been opened, but these were the conditions during our analysis period. And then third, free schools did affect student enrolment in neighbouring schools on average relative to a match sample across a 6-year analysis period. We estimated declines on average of 2.5% of reception year students per year across 4 years in primary schools, and a 4.5% decline in year 7 entry cohorts across all 6 years in neighbouring secondaries. So while relatively small, these were cumulative, of course. So for an average school, student number losses added up across year groups over time. In a simple analysis, we found average losses in neighbouring secondary schools roughly equated to employing about 3 newly qualified teachers across the 6-year period. So having identified then on average an impact of free schools on student enrolment in neighbouring schools, we can move to the next step in the chain of causation that we introduced earlier and ask, did neighbouring schools perceive new competition from a nearby free school? So here we turn to our survey, which found almost 2/3 of responding neighbours did perceive they were in competition with their nearest free school. Neighbours also perceived impacts on their school due to the free school, including declines in student roles and popularity among parents, a loss of funding, and to a lesser extent, an increase in free school meal eligibility in their school. We can also note a level of diversity among our neighbouring school respondents, with a third reporting that they had never been affected by their nearest free school, and a minority collaborating with the free school, both in the absence of perceived competition, about 10%, and alongside competition, about 15%. So as set out in the table there, we also found that predictors of neighbouring schools reporting perceived competition included their perception that the free school appealed to more advantaged students, surplus school capacity locally, the neighbour had a low Ofsted grade, and the neighbour was a secondary school. And these differed to predictions of collaboration, which included belonging to a shared multi-academy trust and perceiving the free school was innovative, against one of several variables we asked about innovation. And that perceived free school innovation did not predict competition was also something interesting to note. So then we can ask next, to what extent did neighbouring schools take any action due to the presence of a nearby free school? And here, again, drawing on our survey findings, we found a strong relationship between perceived competition and reported action taking. So a standard deviation increase in our competition index was associated with almost half a standard deviation increase in reported action taking. We also asked neighbours about different potential domains of action taking, and as we set out there, these were what we termed externally focused actions, including new marketing, promotion, activities, and provision of extracurricular activities, clubs, etc. Accountability focused actions to place greater emphasis on attainment in national tests, Ofsted grades, and or on core curriculum subjects. And then third, on what we termed internally focused actions relating directly to the quality of classroom teaching and learning, teacher performance management, and monitoring student progress. Now, these three domains were informed by the existing literature in our survey design. We also developed a confirmatory factor analysis of the survey responses, which supported the grouping of action taking into these three domains. And then we looked at the association of reported competition to action taking by the domains. And as set out in the table there, the strongest association was to externally focused actions. Competition was also associated, albeit slightly less strongly, with accountability focused actions. But competition did not predict internally focused action taking. And this points to free school competition spurring schools to deploy more resources to improve their appeal or performance in external metrics, potentially in a race to recruit from a fixed pool of students, but without a focus on improving classroom practices. And this obviously raises at least questions about assumptions of efficient competition relating to internal academic quality. And drawing on our case studies, we can also make a set of interpretations about why neighbouring schools might have been acting in these ways. So marketing, promotion, extracurricular actions are relatively cheap, low risk options that can be designed to influence recruitment. External accountabilities inform parental choice and state intervention, of course, and can be responded to without necessarily changing classroom practices. By contrast, internal actions can be expensive and risky, involving change to organizational patterns and or teacher practices, which can take time to enact and may not link directly to accountability metrics or be easily intelligible to parents. So having set out an overview of some of our potential mechanisms of competition, we're now going to move on and look at potential outcomes. First, in terms of student attainment in neighbouring schools. So as a reminder here, we used matched difference and differences design to estimate conditional free school effects on yearly changes in attainment. We were interested in average performance in English and maths at aged 11 and age 16. So we recognise the limitations of this, but we focused on these two core subjects to maximise the comparability of our measures over time, particularly given substantial changes in national assessments in England across our analysis period. So we placed all schools in a 1,000-point ranking divided by 10, so the results can be interpreted as a percentage point changes in a school's position in national rankings. So we therefore capture a relative change in attainment that push neighbouring schools up or pull them down our ranking compared with matched untreated schools. So we found no improvement or deterioration on average in student attainment in neighbouring primary schools. For secondary neighbours, we found a modest increase in student attainment on average. So in a hypothetical school market of 100 schools, a school with a nearby free school would move up between 1 or 2 positions in the league table each year for 4 years, beginning the second year after a free school opened. And we were particularly interested to use our defined mechanisms to explore the potential influences on this modest improvement that we estimated in secondary neighbours. So we therefore tested common proxies of competition, including distance to a free school quality, and the extent of pupil loss we estimated at a neighbouring school. But we found none of these were associated with the identified improvement. But given the potential of social selection, we also asked whether estimated improvement might relate to a neighbouring school's ability to recruit and retain students better positioned to perform well. So to do so, we compared 2 sets of groupings of schools that experienced a large change in their student composition, measuring change as at least 1 within school standard deviation above mean. And our first set of school groups looked at change by prior attainment and free school meal eligibility. And the second set looked at change by prior attainment and ethnicity. So to report on those analyses, the slide now sets out the results in differences graphs. So the plots on the right hand side of the graph show the post-treatment years, that is after the free school opened nearby, and the y-axis measures relative improvement or decline. And in this first graph, the blue data points are neighbouring schools that experienced, after a free school opened, a large increase in their percentage of students who had low prior attainment and were eligible for free school meals. So for these schools, we did not observe improvement or indeed decline in student attainment. By contrast, the red data points are neighbouring schools that experienced, after a free school opened, a large increase in their percentage of students who had high prior attainment and were not eligible for free school meals. And among these schools, we did observe improvement. And then in this second graph, we develop a similar analysis and find a somewhat stronger pattern of difference. So this time the blue data points are neighbouring schools that experienced, after a free school opened, a large increase in their percentage of students who had low prior attainment and were white British. These schools on average showed no sustained improvement. The red data points are schools that experienced, after a free school opened, a large increase in the percentage of students who had high prior attainment and were not white British. And here again, we did observe improvement. So we also wanted to understand the context of these differential trends. So we investigated the student composition of the 2 sets of school groups that I just introduced in the year prior to a free school opening, which we can call baseline. So this provided insights into whether the schools were, on average, already different from one another at baseline. And in this bar chart, the first pair of bars are neighbouring schools that gained a growing percentage of free school meal eligible students with low prior attainment. The blue bars show at baseline these schools already had a higher proportion of free school meal eligible students with low prior attainment than the average of all neighbouring schools, which is the third pair of bars at the bottom. They also had a lower proportion of students with high prior attainment who were not eligible for free school meals, which is the red bar. And the second pair of bars shows the reverse was true for the other grouping of schools. So that is schools gaining a large percentage of students with higher prior attainment and who were not eligible for free school meals already had at baseline a higher percentage of these students than average, as evidenced in the red bar. And then a similar pattern is evidence in this second bar chart, which looks at the second grouping of schools relating to prior attainment and ethnicity. So, in concluding from this, we're tentative as common trend assumptions can be less likely to hold in the context of this subgroup analysis. However, we believe this provides useful indicative evidence about potential reasons for our overall findings. So that is, while there are likely to be a range of influences, it was not free school quality or pupil loss per se that influenced improvement in secondaries. Rather, it appears that it's how these combined with direction and intensity of any compositional change that we measured, so that competitive effects on secondary school performance appear to have been mediated by the extent of compositional change after the arrival of a nearby free school. And in turn, these compositional changes appear to have been influenced by the existing composition of neighbouring schools prior to a free school opening. And in saying that, we can also note here a set of insights that emerged in our case studies, where higher status schools with locally advantaged intakes commonly reported having greater capacity for competitive action, while lower status schools with more disadvantaged students were more likely to report adverse compositional changes after a free school opened nearby. So I'd like to turn finally to the second potential outcome we analysed. That's social segregation. Of course, the importance of segregation between schools is widely recognised, with decreased segregation being argued to support community cohesion, a culture of mutual respect and participation, and to potentially reduce social economic attainment gaps. Our main measure of social segregation was relative isolation. We have subsequently sort of developed robustness checks using the dissimilarity index with similar findings. But relative isolation measures whether free school enrolment was associated with changes in the likelihood of students meeting peers from the same background as themselves at school. We used electoral wards as our defined local areas in the primary school phase and constituencies for the secondary phase. And this reflected our preference for using areas with clear boundaries to measure segregation over time, and to use a scale at which parents could conceivably consider choice and schools compete for students. So using these measures, we found more widely a trend of decreasing segregation between schools in England during our analysis period. And this corroborated, if I can say the word, existing findings that decreasing school segregation by ethnicity, for instance, reflects a longer term decrease in white British students and increases in other ethnic groups. In relation to free schools, however, we found an opposite trend, particularly in wards in which primary free schools open. So as the table sets out, on average, primary free school enrolment was associated with modest increases in social segregation for students speaking English as an additional language, that's EAL, Black, Asian and other ethnic minority students, that's BAE, and white British students, that's WBRI in the table. We also found a small decrease in segregation for students with special educational needs. In the secondary phase, changes in social segregation were not statistically significant on average, but there was a similar pattern of increased segregation for white British students in areas with low ethnic diversity in rural areas. Now, interpreting these patterns, we know that changes in social segregation typically result from local processes. We therefore drew on our case studies to make tentative interpretations of those wider trends. Our case studies did identify a range of examples of social segregation and different ways in which individual free schools were seen to create new options for parents from particular social groups to choose schools that were more homogenous than the local area. And this included perceptions of both self-segregation by minority ethnic families and perceived white flight. And we can set out several examples of this. So first, the DFE's own analysis shows that minority faith free schools may have created opportunities for self-segregation. So on average, 80% of students at Islamic, Sikh and Hindu free schools are from an Asian ethnicity, and over 80% of students at Jewish free schools are from a white ethnicity. So here the Social Integration Commission has also expressed concern over these minority faith schools in relation to their duties on community cohesion. And then the other three examples on the slide of a no excuses free school, an urban primary and a secondary rural or semi-rural school are drawn from our case studies. And briefly, I'd like to provide a short insight into each of these from the perspective of neighbouring schools. So first, in the case of an explicitly no excuses secondary free school, participating neighbouring school head teachers argued the free school's intake did reflect local patterns of social economic status, but that its ethos was self-selective, appealing particularly to aspirational and minority ethnic families with in quotes, a really strong commitment to self-improvement through education. Let's say in a way that in a white working class community, it might not be quite so prevalent. And the no excuses ethos was also seen to lead by neighbouring schools to higher permanent exclusions from the free school than the local average. So secondly, in the case of an urban primary free school, one neighbour described, in quotes, an element of white flight where, again in quotes, it's parents who are looking for children who will socialise in the same way that theirs will as they get older, who choose the free school. Another neighbour described how their school was now referred to as, in quotes, the Muslim school as a consequence. And both these head teachers argued the free school was exclusionary, so that their schools were getting, in quotes, a disproportionate number of difficult parents who've been told their children's needs can't be met by the free school. And thirdly, in the final case here of a semi-rural secondary free school, it was seen to appeal to, in quotes, a certain type of parent who can't afford to pay for private and were, again in quotes, happy to send their children to a state school but don't want them mixing with a broad range of society. And the free school was also seen by neighbours to engage in pre-cropping activities by contacting parents of particular children prior to enrolment, which was argued, in quotes, to be another way of pushing away difficult children who might be hard to provide for. Now, it's important to say that in each of these cases, then participants described different choice and social selection processes, which they were understood to be increasing social segregation locally. And we can note that in several cases, free schools contested the free school head teachers that we interviewed contested aspects of these accounts, noting how other schools also engaged in competitive recruitment practices. And so to clarify then, our argument from our case studies was not that free schools alone were enacting social segregation, as higher status neighbours were also seen to be doing so. And so rather than free school intakes alone, we suggest it's the plethora of local actions and responses following a free school's opening that are likely to be related to increases in social segregation that we observed. And this was not the case in every case study locality, but particularly where competition was perceived to be intensive. So we've covered a fair amount of ground, and just very lastly, I'm not going to make detailed conclusions, but I'd rather just like to end by highlighting several recommendations we made, drawing on our findings. So firstly, we recommended to the DfE that they should reassess the paradigmatic assumptions that it has regularly set out on how choice and competition work in the state school system. And we argued that they could helpfully recognize that schools have really prioritized, at least in our research, changes in classroom practices when subjected to new market pressures from free schools. And for them also to recognize the potential of social selection and the detrimental social outcomes that this can create. And of course, this takes us back to the chain of causation, with the argument that policy might best be cautious of accepting assumptions associated with efficient competition by balancing these at least with insights on social selection. And then just lastly, we also recommended these general points inform specific changes, including in terms of how the DfE meets its legal duty to assess the potential impacts of free schools, because to date that has been done on an individual level, but we think they should include criteria at a local level that could inquire into social segregation, and also how free schools are instructed to meet their duties on inclusion and community cohesion, and how these are monitored. And then just lastly, how new schools are open going forward. The free school process enabled civil society groups to contract with central government, and this involved, substantial centralization of decisions and a reliance on forecasted data that regularly overestimated place need. So we recommended a new approach is needed to better enable local authorities to meet their statutory duties, to ensure sufficient places and to strategically manage places, particularly as the pupil population is declining in the years ahead. Yeah, thank you very much for listening to me.